Welcome back to the deep dive, where we tear into the densest academic sources so you don't have to wade through the index.
Hmm.
Today, we've got an assignment that is deceptively monumental, diving into the foundational concepts found in just one alphabetical slice of the MIT Encyclopedia of the Cognitive Sciences. We're talking about the dense, difficult, and surprisingly revealing R section.
It's an incredible stack of sources, really. The R entries act like a perfect blueprint of the entire field. They drag you across philosophy, linguistics, computation, neuroscience, and then right back again.
Yeah, they really do.
And our listener, who's looking for that shortcut to deep understanding, has given us the perfect mission. Still these concepts, do it thoroughly, and show how they all, connect.
Absolutely. Our mission is to decode this alphabetical chunk. And what we found weren't just definitions. We found three huge foundational tensions that are really driving the entire enterprise of cognitive science.
That's a great way to put it.
If you can get your head around these three conflicts, you basically understand the field.
That's so right. The first tension we'll explore today is all about the nature of reality and meaning. I mean, how does any system, human, artificial, whatever, establish what's true? How does it refer to things in the world when everything's so ambiguous and, well, philosophers are so skeptical?
And from there, we swing hard into the second tension, the quest for rationality. We start with this idealized, flawless logic you see in classical economics, and then we watch it just clash violently with the messy, constrained reality of how human minds actually work.
Which leads right to bounded rationality.
Exactly. And then finally, we get into the nuts and bolts, the architecture of computation and cognition. This is where we ground all that philosophical debate in the physical world.
Right, the literal hardware of the brain, like the retina, and then the computational models we build to try and mimic learning and decision-making.
Mhm.
Things like recurrent networks and reinforcement learning.
Okay, let's unpack this dense R stack. We have to start where so many of these foundational problems begin, trying to figure out what someone else means from absolute scratch. So we kick off with radical interpretation. This is a philosophical thought experiment, and it asks a really fundamental question. How do you begin to translate or even understand the beliefs of a community whose language and culture are completely alien to you?
Right, no prior knowledge, no dictionary, no bilingual helper, nothing.
It's the ultimate test for any theory of meaning, isn't it?
It is. It's the ultimate test. And this problem was explored intensely by W.V. Quine and Donald Davidson. They're two major figures who approached the same challenge, how to build a theory of meaning from nothing, ex nihilo. But they came to profoundly different conclusions about whether meaning and belief are even objective.
Davidson's approach is the one that seems more optimistic, I guess. He's optimistic about finding some kind of truth. He defines the core problem as a paradox.
Paradox.
If we knew what the foreigners meant by their sentences, we could figure out their beliefs. And if we knew their beliefs, we could figure out what they meant. But we don't know either, so we're stuck.
It's the ultimate chicken and egg problem in communication. So Davidson realized he needed a fixed point, something the interpreter and the native could share, even without a common language.
His solution was, well, it was brilliant.
It was. He co-opted Tarski's theory of truth. Tarski's work was about defining truth, and he showed that any theory of truth has to produce what are called T-sentences.
Okay, a T sentence looks like snow is white is true in English if and only if snow is white.
Exactly. Now here's the twist. Tarski used that form to define truth. Davidson flips it. He assumes we, the interpreters, already have a basic grasp of the concept of truth. We know what it is for a sentence to be true.
So he uses the fact that a foreigner's sentence is true, under the same conditions that would make our own sentence true, to actually derive the meaning. He's using truth to get to meaning.
Precisely. And this whole process is constrained by something called the principle of charity.
And this isn't just about, being nice to the people you're studying.
No, not at all. It's a rigorous methodological principle. It requires you, the interpreter, to maximize your agreement with the foreigner's beliefs. You have to assume they're rational, and that they generally hold sentences true in circumstances where we would also hold them true.
Unless you can explain the disagreement.
Right, unless
Yeah.
you can clearly attribute it to some understandable error or just a difference in experience.
Oh.
Davidson believed this powerful constraint would, minimize any kind of ambiguity or indeterminacy.
But then there's Quine. Quine, who came before Davidson, saw that indeterminacy not as some minor technical issue, but as a foundational, even devastating truth.
Yeah, Quine introduced the indeterminacy of translation, and his claim is radical. He says you could develop two completely rival, incompatible translation manuals.
And the crucial part is that both manuals would fit all the objective, measurable facts, every word they say, everything they do.
Everything. Yet they would reject countless translations offered by the other manual. They are, in a sense, empirically equivalent, but conceptually at war with each other.
And the classic example everyone learns is the Gavagai example.
A rabbit darts across the field. The native says, Gavagai. We, intuitively translate this as rabbit.
It seems obvious.
It does. But Quine points out this single observation doesn't actually fix the reference. It might mean undetached rabbit parts, or a temporary rabbit phase, or even the abstract concept of rabbithood.
This is what he calls the inscrutability of reference.
Exactly. And what's so chilling about Quine's argument is his insistence that pointing or doing more experiments won't help. If you point, you're still relying on these untestable assumptions about what the native considers the unit of reference. Are you pointing at the whole animal, or just a part of it, or a moment in its existence?
So if translation is indeterminate, reference itself is inscrutable. It just isn't an objective fact out there in the world.
And if meaning and reference aren't objective facts, then the intentions, beliefs, and desires we attribute to people, well, they aren't objective facts either.
Wow. That is a profound threat to the entire science of the mind.
It is. It's a huge challenge. Quine and later philosophers like Paul Churchland argued that these intentional concepts, belief, desire, intention, are fundamentally non-factual. This leads to a conclusion that really supports limitative materialism.
So the idea that our everyday talk about beliefs and desires is just, what, a kind of pre-scientific theory? Folk psychology?
The pseudo-theory, yeah. And maybe we should just eliminate it entirely and only talk about physical brain states. It suggests that when we talk about what someone believes, we might just be using a kind of useful fiction, not describing an objective, factual state that a neuroscientist could ever find.
That immediately forces us to step back and look at where knowledge even comes from in the first place.
It does.
Which leads us right into the classic debate, rationalism versus empiricism.
This is the foundational debate in epistemology, the study of knowledge. It's all about the tension between the internal resources the mind brings to the table, that's rationalism, and the external data we gather through our senses, which is empiricism.
So the empiricist view, championed by figures like John Locke and David Hume, starts with this idea of the mind as a tabula rasa.
A blank slate.
Right. All factual knowledge has to come from experience. They insist that knowledge rests on inductive experience. We see things happen over and over, and we derive general rules from that.
For them, a priori truths you can know without experience, are really limited. They're just analytic statements like definitions. All bachelors are unmarried. You don't need to go out and check.
But the rationalist view from people like Descartes and Leibniz says, hold on. Experience is necessary to, trigger knowledge, but it is fundamentally insufficient to account for the depth and certainty of the knowledge we have.
Right. They argue the mind comes pre-equipped with a set of innate ideas and fundamental structural principles. Reason provides these a priori principles, necessary truths, often mathematical or logical. They give us a bedrock of certainty.
Something that induction, which could always be overturned by the next piece of data, can never really provide. And it's crucial to see how this ancient debate still informs modern cognitive science. I mean, historically, even mentalistic models, like Helmholtz's idea of unconscious inference for perception, that actually mirrors the empiricist reliance on learning. He explained how we perceive depth, not as some innate gift, but as a rapid, learned, unconscious inference based on all our past experiences.
But the most explicit modern inheritor of rationalism is found in linguistics. It's nativism.
Right.
Modern linguists like Chomsky argue for concepts like universal grammar, an innate set of principles that guides how all human children acquire language.
And they don't rely on the old metaphysical arguments of Descartes. Their argument is computational.
It's the poverty of the stimulus argument.
Yeah.
The inductive data, the language that children actually hear, is just too limited and messy and full of errors to account for the speed and the structured way they acquire language. The structure must be innate, just as the rationalists argued for innate ideas.
That makes a perfect transition to our next R reference, theories of. If our knowledge isn't entirely from experience, and our meaning isn't just subjective like Quine might suggest, then how does this stuff in our head actually link up to the world outside?
In virtue of what does a representation relate to reality, that's the core semantic problem.
And for a long time, the dominant theory was the description theory.
Right, from Frege and Russell. It suggested that reference is determined by the descriptions or the cluster of knowledge that competent speakers associate with that representation. So gold refers to the substance that satisfies most of the descriptions we have for it. It's yellow, it's malleable, it's chemically inert.
But the encyclopedia highlights why description theories failed, and failed pretty decisively in the 1970s. This was largely thanks to Kripke and Putnam.
Yes, and they used two powerful philosophical weapons against it: the arguments from ignorance and error.
Okay, let's take ignorance. You can successfully use the name Babe Ruth or the term electron, even if you're totally ignorant of the specific criteria that actually define them.
You don't need a whole biography or a physics textbook in your head to refer to Babe Ruth. And then there's error. If the descriptions you do have are just factually wrong, let's say you think gold is an element that burns, you can still successfully refer to gold. The reference stays fixed even when the description fails completely.
There's also that deeper problem you mentioned earlier, the completeness problem. If bachelor is defined by adult, unmarried, and male, we've just pushed the problem back a level.
You have. You still need an explanation for how those three words refer. Description theories end up defining words with other words, and they never provide that ultimate non-linguistic explanation of how language hooks onto the world.
So the failure of these theories forced a radical shift in the philosophy of language.
A huge shift, leading to the external causal theories. The core idea here, famously summed up by Hilary Putnam, is that meanings just ain't in the head. Reference gets fixed by external, non-mental relations between the representation and reality.
And the source breaks these causal theories down into three distinct types of external relations. They all prioritize the outside world over your internal dictionary.
The first is the historical cause, from Kripke. This theory says reference is fixed by a causal chain leading all the way back to the initial act of dubbing or acquisition. When you learn the word Fido, you are borrowing the ability to refer from the person who first used that name for that specific dog.
So your internal knowledge is irrelevant. It's the external historical chain that matters.
Precisely. The second is the reliable cause, associated with Dretske and Fodor. Here, a representation type is reliably correlated with its referent. The word tree in your mind carries information about trees because the presence of actual trees reliably causes you to activate that representation.
So it's a non-accidental informational link, like smoke carrying the information that there's a fire.
That's a great analogy.
Mm-hmm.
And the third is the teleological cause or function for Millikan. This brings Darwinian or evolutionary reasoning into the picture. Reference is fixed by the function that the representation type was selected for.
So why do we have a mental state that refers to danger?
Because that state was selected by evolution to track actual danger in the environment, which helped the organism survive and reproduce. This theory brings evolutionary function directly into semantics.
That is a fascinating way to ground meaning in history, information flow, or evolutionary purpose. Now, let's pivot from philosophy of language to the core structures of language itself and move on to relational grammar, or RG.
RG is a specific model within linguistics, but its importance is in asserting that certain structural concepts are absolutely fundamental. Its defining feature is that grammatical relations like subject, direct object, indirect object are taken as primitive and indispensable concepts in syntax.
So they can't just be reduced to, say, word order or some other structural property.
Exactly. Instead of saying the subject is whatever noun phrase is closest to the verb, RG says the concept of subject itself is essential and irreducible, almost like an axiom in geometry.
Okay, but why is that necessary? What do you gain from that?
You gain the ability to formulate genuine linguistic universals laws about how all languages operate. And you can characterize the class of possible relation-changing constructions you find across all the world's languages. To do this, RG introduced the concept of the stratum.
Walk us through the stratum concept.
Okay, so a clause is represented across multiple levels of structure, or strata. The relations in the initial strata link up with semantic roles like agent and patient, the doer, and the done to.
And the relations in the final strata.
Those determine the superficial features, the stuff you actually see and hear, like verb agreement and the final word order.
The classic example that really illustrates this multi-layered structure is the passive voice. Let's start with an active sentence. The artist painted the mural.
Okay, in the initial stratum of that sentence, the artist is the subject and the mural is the direct object. But in the passive form, the mural was painted by the artist. The final stratum is different. The mural has advanced to become the subject.
And what happens to the original subject, the artist?
It gets demoted. It's demoted to a status known in RG as Comer, which is French for unemployed. It's a relationally unemployed element.
So the fact that they share an initial stratum is what explains why the active and passive sentences mean the same thing. They start at the same deep semantic level.
Exactly. The change in the final stratum explains the difference in the surface features. And this whole process of advancement and demotion is rigorously controlled by a universal constraint, the stratal uniqueness law.
And this is a hard constraint on all human languages.
Yes. It states that only one subject, one direct object, and one indirect object are permitted per stratum. This means if the object advances to become the new subject, the old subject must be stripped of its subject status and become a comer. Otherwise, the law is violated. This universal constraint defines the very limits of how syntax can operate across all languages.
That's a powerful idea. These innate, structured, irreducible rules governing how we communicate. It really echoes that rationalist discussion we were just having.
It does.
Okay, so having established the difficulty of grounding meaning and the presence of innate structure, let's turn to the central question of how an agent behaves, rationality. We jump now to rational agency. Philosophically, this concept is tied to a really profound coherence requirement. Rationality isn't just something we do, it's something we have to be to even qualify as a thinking agent.
Exactly. The source calls this the agent constitutive requirement. No rationality, no agent. An agent's decisions and actions must cohere with its internal system of beliefs, knowledge, desires, and goals.
Right. If a system's beliefs were just hopelessly inconsistent, or if its actions always contradicted its desires.
We would stop attributing beliefs or desires to it at all. It would just be a broken machine.
But the field immediately ran into this colossal theoretical problem, defining the ideal agent. This model, which comes out of classical decision theory, assumes that agents optimize their choices and maximize utility based on their cognitive state.
And the real killer for the ideal agent model is the requirement of logical omniscience.
This sounds demanding.
It's impossible. The ideal agent must possess perfect deductive competence. That means it instantly knows all the logical consequences of all of its beliefs, and it has to maintain zero inconsistency within its entire system.
And this is where the computational rubber really hits the road. Why is this so psychologically unrealistic?
Well, first, we're finite human beings. Psychological studies show we all have predictable inconsistencies and cognitive biases. That's the whole heuristics and biases literature. But second, and this is more critical for AI, representing an ideal agent's deductive competence as a finite computational algorithm is literally impossible.
It's not just hard, it's impossible.
It would violate fundamental principles of theoretical computer science, like Church's undecidability theorem for first-order logic. The ideal rational agent is computationally intractable. It would just freeze, suffering from computational paralysis.
So the field desperately needed a solution, a middle ground, a via media strategy, and this led to the necessary compromise, bounded rationality.
Bounded rationality is the recognition that cognitive systems, human or machine, have to operate within the limits of their finite computational resources, like time and memory. Herbert Simon introduced the central principle of satisficing.
Satisficing. So agents don't maximize or optimize for perfection.
No. They choose decisions that are good enough or satisfactory.
It's fascinating how this completely reframes the idea of error. Instead of viewing human departures from optimality as fundamental flaws, they're seen as symptoms of using efficient but formally imperfect, quick but dirty heuristic procedures.
Precisely. Formally perfect inference procedures are often just too computationally complex. We use heuristics not because we're stupid, but because they are necessary to avoid that computational paralysis. We trade optimality for tractability.
So minimal rationality, which people like Cherniak advocated for, just requires a minimal degree of coherence. Enough to qualify as an agent, but nowhere near logical omniscience.
Exactly, and that compromise is what makes cognitive science possible.
This philosophical framework found its most powerful application, and its greatest source of conflict in economics, with rational choice theory, or RCT.
RCT, developed by thinkers like von Neumann and Morgenstern, is rooted purely in instrumental rationality. Reason is just a tool to efficiently achieve predetermined ends or desires.
And its core claim is purely mathematical.
It is. It says that agents whose preferences satisfy a basic set of axioms, like transitivity, if you prefer A to B and B to C, you must prefer A to C, then those agents choose as if they are maximizing their expected utility.
The irony here is that RCT was designed to be psychology neutral. It was supposed to describe behavior without guessing at internal psychological mechanisms.
But its failures immediately demand a psychological explanation. The clash with real-world behavior is just dramatic.
For example, RCT requires motivations to be strictly forward-looking. Past costs are irrelevant.
Sunk costs.
Right. Yet most people commit the so-called sunk cost fallacy. We base current decisions on past investments all the time.
Which suggests that humans are prioritizing consistency or the maintenance of a personal identity, a psychological goal, over the pure future optimization that RCT demands.
And the paradoxes just get worse when RCT is applied to strategic interactions, which is the basis of game theory. When you model a system where all the agents are ideally rational, the outcomes are often bizarrely unreasonable.
Especially the failure of cooperation.
Right.
Think of the prisoner's dilemma, or the even more complex centipede game. Pure, ideal rationality dictates that you should not cooperate, that you should defect, even when mutual cooperation would give a better result for everyone involved.
So the insight here is really profound.
It is a small departure from the assumption of perfect rationality or the introduction of imperfect, bounded rationality among the agents is often what's necessary to nudge the system back toward reasonable social behavior and cooperation.
So the economic model that was intended to describe perfect agents actually shows that perfect rationality can be socially destructive.
Yes. Bounded rationality isn't just necessary for a finite mind. It might be necessary for social cohesion itself. RCT can't resolve these paradoxes without adopting a full-blown theory of mind, the very thing it originally tried to repress.
We can formalize this a bit more in rational decision-making. Formally, a rational choice involves finding a complete preorder of alternatives.
Meaning the preference relation is reflexive, transitive, and complete. You can compare any two options.
And then you just choose the maximally desirable option. Simple.
And when uncertainty gets involved, we use the model of maximizing expected utility. We quantify how desirable things are with a cardinal utility function, and we maximize based on the total utility of all possible consequences, weighted by their probability. That's the gold standard for optimization.
But again, humans consistently fail to meet this ideal. We satisfice instead of maximize. Our preferences can be intransitive.
And this failure to meet the ideal is why the notion of satisficing is absolutely crucial in AI problem solving.
In AI, the approach is often called heuristic rationality. This is a concept heavily influenced by Newell.
It's a weaker criterion than expected utility maximization. It prioritizes finding an action that leads toward a goal. It often downplays the need for that rigorous, comparative evaluation among all possible alternatives. It is inherently a satisficing strategy, and it's necessary for any practical, time-constrained AI search.
And if individual rationality is this messy, group rationality is, well, it's nearly impossible.
Yeah, the source introduces Arrow's impossibility theorem. It's a mathematical proof of how difficult it is to aggregate individual preferences into a single, rational group preference that satisfies some basic democratic criteria.
And the only way to guarantee a rational group outcome, according to Arrow, is
effectively through dictatorship, where one individual's preferences just win out. This mathematical impossibility is why game theory and multi-agent systems that deal with aggregation are so incredibly complex.
Okay, so from the conceptual constraints of rationality, we now move to the engineering constraints of computation, starting with recurrent networks. These are a fundamental category of neural networks, and what makes them special is that they have cycles in their connectivity graph.
Right. Those cycles allow the network state at any given moment to depend on its past states. That makes them natural models for systems that have to deal with sequence, time, and memory.
And we can analyze them in two major ways. As constraint solvers that are trying to find an equilibrium,
Or as dynamic systems that show complex, time-varying behavior.
let's start with the constraint solvers, the undirected equilibrium networks. These include things like Hopfield networks and Boltzmann machines. Undirected means that if there's a connection from node A to node B, there has to be a connection of equal weight going back from B to A.
A Hopfield network uses binary nodes. They're either on or off, and it's defined by an energy function, which we call elay. It maps the state of the whole network to a single scalar value.
And the system is designed to evolve in a way that minimizes this energy function.
Exactly. The local minima of that energy function are the stable equilibrium states. And these are incredibly useful for things like associative memory, retrieving a memory from an incomplete or noisy prompt, and for constraint satisfaction. The system just settles into the closest remembered pattern that minimizes the overall constraints.
After that, we have the Boltzmann machine, which is basically the probabilistic version of a Hopfield network.
Right. Instead of strictly moving downhill to minimize energy, it uses the Boltzmann distribution to assign probabilities to states. States with lower energy are more probable, but, and this is key, high-energy states are still possible. That allows the network to escape local minima.
And this introduction of probability was a huge deal.
It was, because it allowed for the use of stochastic search methods like Monte Carlo simulation, and specifically Gibbs sampling. This whole process is often sped up using simulated annealing, where you gradually lower the temperature of the system. You allow for random exploration early on, and then you force convergence later.
What's fascinating is the alternative to that, the mean field methods. Instead of probabilistic sampling, these methods make a deterministic approximation.
They exploit the density of the connections. They treat the value of each node as being well determined by the average behavior of its many neighbors. This, combined with gradually decreasing the temperature, a method called deterministic annealing, became the preferred way to update even the original Hopfield networks.
Okay, so if we switch gears to general directed networks, we lose that reciprocal weight constraint.
We do,
Yeah.
and that allows for arbitrary connectivity and far more complex dynamics. You can get oscillating patterns, limit cycles, even chaotic behavior. The activation of a node at time t plus $1 is calculated based on inputs from time 2, which makes them excellent for sequential tasks like speech recognition.
So how do we teach these complex directed networks to learn a sequence?
The general-purpose algorithm is backpropagation in time. Conceptually, what you do is you take the recurrent network and you unroll it across the sequence of time steps. You turn it into a massive, deep feed-forward network. Then, you can apply the standard backpropagation algorithm to calculate the error gradient.
And this leads us directly to one of the biggest challenges in deep learning. This is a key technical insight for you, our listener, the vanishing gradient problem.
This problem is fundamental. To learn long-term dependencies, that is, to remember a piece of information from 100 time steps ago, the error signal has to be propagated backward through 100 layers of that unrolled network.
And because each layer applies a derivative, a slope, if that slope is even slightly less than 1.
Repeated multiplication just causes the gradient to shrink rapidly towards 0. It's like whispering a secret down a very long line of people. By the time it reaches the first person, the signal is basically gone.
So that lack of signal makes learning those long-term connections nearly impossible without specialized architectures.
Right, and that's why we've seen the rise of things like LSTMs and attention mechanisms to combat this very problem.
That's a perfect example of a computational constraint, echoing the philosophical limits we saw earlier. Let's look at another model derived from cognitive theory. Reinforcement learning, or RL.
RL is fundamentally different from supervised learning, where you give the network explicit input-output pairs. RL is about learning by interaction with the environment to maximize a scalar reward signal. The agent is its own teacher, discovering optimal behavior through trial and error.
The crucial dilemma here, which ties right back to bounded rationality, is the exploration-exploitation trade-off. This is unavoidable for any successful RL agent.
You have to constantly balance two opposing forces. Exploitation means taking the action that you currently know gives the highest reward. You're getting the reward now.
And exploration.
That means trying an unknown, possibly suboptimal action that just might, reveal a much better reward pathway for the future. An agent that only exploits will get stuck in a local optimum. An agent that only explores will never achieve its goal efficiently.
It's the ultimate struggle between short-term gain and long-term optimal strategy.
And this whole process is formally structured using the Markov decision process, or MDP, framework.
Okay.
In an MDP, the agent transitions between states based on its actions, and the environment stochastically gives out rewards. The agent's goal is to maximize the expected discounted return, the sum of all future rewards, where rewards you get sooner are valued more highly than rewards you get later.
And within this framework, the source highlights Q-learning as a fundamental model-free algorithm.
Q-learning works by learning the value of taking a specific action in a specific state, $6. We call that the Qter value. And crucially, this learning is done entirely from observing the rewards and state transitions you get through experience. You don't need an explicit model of how the environment works.
So the algorithm is guaranteed to converge to an optimal policy as long as it does enough exploration. That model-free nature is its greatest strength.
It is, and that is why the relevance of RL is huge in real-world applications like robotics. When the environment is noisy, unpredictable, or just too complex for human programmers to model explicitly, RL is the perfect fit. It supports any time planning, which means the agent's policy is constantly improving with more computational effort. RL has given us the best-known solutions for incredibly complex stochastic problems, from backgammon to managing elevator dispatching systems.
Moving now from abstract computation back to the concrete realities of human cognition, we'll begin with reading. This is a process that the cognitive era just fundamentally redefined.
It really did. Before the 20th century, reading was often seen as simple paired associate learning. You see the letters, the stimulus, and you recall the meaning, the response.
But cognitive science revealed that reading is an extremely high-level linguistic process. It requires access to vast, higher-order knowledge, syntactic structure, rhetorical goals, topical expertise, all of which is necessary just for comprehension.
But the research hit a really paradoxical finding about word recognition that became central to literacy research. Researchers tried to show that context helps you recognize words.
And they found the opposite.
They found the opposite. Skillful readers' word recognition is fast, accurate, and almost entirely indifferent to textual context. Context only measurably helps poor readers.
So the stark conclusion was that poorly developed word recognition skills are the single primary driver of comprehension differences between good and poor readers.
It's not about guessing from context. It's all about decoding speed.
So how did connectionist models resolve this theoretical tension between high-level comprehension and low-level recognition?
The introduction of connectionist, or PDP, models showed that these recognition phenomena, like how frequently a word appears or how consistent its spelling is, they emerge naturally from the statistical properties of the language through associative learning. The models demonstrated how the system automatically links orthography, the spelling, to phonology, the sound, and semantics, the meaning.
And the microdynamic of skilled reading is surprisingly precise. We don't read ahead, we read line by line, word by word.
That's right. During the brief fixation the eye makes on a word, its spelling is registered with letter-wise precision and automatically mapped to the appropriate speech patterns. Reading is fundamentally a rapid, parallel process of accessing stored knowledge, not some slow, sequential guessing game.
And this brings us to the most critical cognitive insight for successful literacy: phonemic awareness.
This is the single core causal factor. Phonemic awareness is the insight that a word isn't just one sound, it's a sequence of discrete phones. For many children, this insight is actually relatively difficult to acquire, and its underdevelopment correlates very strongly with severe reading disabilities.
Because you can't grasp the alphabetic principle, the idea that letters represent sounds, unless you understand that words are divisible into sounds in the first place.
Exactly. But the relationship isn't one way. You need some basic awareness to get started, but then instruction and practice in decoding and spelling reciprocally advance the child's sensitivity to phonemes. The key lesson is that learning to read is a highly interactive process that actively builds on prior knowledge and specific structural insights about language.
Okay, shifting now from the individual cognitive process of reading to the highest level of collective belief structure, we move to religious ideas and practices examined through a cognitive approach.
This cognitive approach, driven by researchers like Sperber and Boyer, it moves away from sociological or symbolic analysis. They study religion through the lens of inferential processes and the organization of beliefs in the mind.
So the question is, why do these specific ideas spread and persist?
Right. And their answer is that ideas succeed if they achieve cognitive equilibrium, meaning they are easy to transmit, easy to remember, and easy to integrate into our existing mental structures.
The central theory here is the minimal violation principle.
Yes. Religious concepts successfully propagate by making minor strategic violations of our universal intuitive ontology. Our innate ontology includes basic categories like person, animal, and object, and each has default assumptions. For example, we assume people have minds and objects obey gravity.
So if you violate too much, the concept becomes too complex to remember. But if you violate just enough,
It becomes attention-grabbing and memorable. Basically, take the concept of a spirit or a ghost. It violates only the physical properties of a person. It can walk through walls, but it retains all the core assumptions, like intentionality and belief.
or consider divination.
That involves transferring the property of intentionality mind, knowledge, to an inert artifact. It allows a stick or a crystal to know things. That minor violation is what makes the concept sticky.
The cognitive approach also applies to ritual theory, especially the work of Lawson and Macaulay.
They argue that we use our ordinary cognitive resources for action representation when we process rituals. But the causal sequence of the ritual action is special because it presupposes that the causal chain stops with superhuman agents.
The buck stops with the gods.
The buck stops with the gods. And this reliance on superhuman agents dictates the structure, the sequence, and the acceptability of different types of rituals across all cultures.
The most surprising finding for me comes from experimental psychology on believers. When adherents are asked to make online judgments about God's actions in real time, under pressure, they often default to simple anthropomorphic concepts.
Yes, they treat God as a highly powerful, yet somehow spatially and temporally limited human.
Even when these same individuals formally claim to believe the complex theological doctrines of omniscience and omnipresence.
Right, the intuitive, minimally violated concept is what guides our rapid everyday inference. It trumps the complex, learned doctrine in immediate cognitive processing.
Finally, let's turn to the literal machinery of perception, the retina. This is our physical constraint on vision.
The retina is not a simple camera film. It's a sheet of brain tissue that performs substantial initial processing before the signal even leaves the eye. It's composed of 5 major neuron classes: rods and cones, which are the photoreceptors, then bipolar, horizontal, amacrine, and finally ganglion cells.
And the mechanism of this initial processing is based on receptive fields and antagonism.
Right. A ganglion cell integrates input over a roughly circular area, but critically, that field has an antagonistic surround. You can think of it as the retina's built-in sharpening filter.
So for an ON center cell, light falling precisely on the center excites it.
But light falling on the surrounding area inhibits it. This mechanism means the cell isn't just registering light intensity, it's registering difference, the contrast between light and dark.
And this antagonism creates parallel on and O-off-F pathways in the retina, making sure that we are highly sensitive to edges and boundaries, which are critical for recognizing objects.
But we have to recognize the limits imposed by this architecture. Visual acuity is limited by the density of cones and rods, which is highest in the fovea. And our sensitivity to rapid changes is limited by temporal integration, the time it takes for photoreceptors to register and process a change in light.
Which is about 300 milliseconds for rods in night vision and 50 milliseconds for cones in daylight.
Exactly. And the physical constraints also profoundly limit our perception of color, starting with rod univariance.
Rods, used for low-light vision, have only one visual pigment, rhodopsin.
So once a photon is absorbed, all information about its wavelength is lost. Only its intensity matters. Because they can't distinguish wavelength from intensity, rods exhibit univariance, which is the physical reason why night vision is strictly grayscale.
And human color vision is trichromatic, relying on 3 cone types, S, M, and L cones.
Since we only have 3 sensors, we can only extract 3 components of wavelength information. This limits us to perceiving colors that are just combinations of 3 primaries. This limitation in spectral resolution, the source notes, is considered an evolutionary trade-off.
A compromise that was likely necessary to maximize spatial resolution visual acuity, which requires a higher density of photoreceptors packed into the available space. We've spent this time establishing how agents find truth and meaning. Now let's apply that same critical lens to science itself. How does cognitive science establish its own truth? This brings us to the debate over realism and anti-realism.
Realism is the common sense view, really. There's an observer-independent world out there, and successful science gives us objective, approximately true knowledge of the entities and structures that populate it.
The primary support for realism is often called the miracles argument.
Right. The success of science, its ability to predict phenomena, build technologies, cure diseases, would be inexplicable. It would be miracle unless its theories were at least approximately true and its theoretical entities, like electrons or genes, actually existed.
But anti-realists reject this inference to the best explanation. They argue that the success of science only proves it has developed reliable tools for organizing our experience.
And they mount 2 powerful philosophical attacks against realism.
The first is historical pessimism. The best theories of the past, from phlogiston theory to the luminiferous ether, were repeatedly overthrown, despite being massively successful in their time.
So this history suggests that our current true theories are also likely to be false and will eventually be replaced.
The second is underdetermination. This asserts that the available evidence can't definitively decide between 2 or more empirically equivalent theories.
If 2 theories make exactly the same predictions, the evidence can't tell you which one is literally true. So if science can't select a single true theory, it can't deliver objective truth.
Given these strong attacks, philosophers have looked for compromises. One such compromise is entity realism.
Entity realism claims that we should only commit to the reality of the theoretical entities themselves, like electrons, quarks, or neurons, without committing to the full, literal truth of the complex theories that use them.
But even that position struggles to differentiate between a truly real, discovered entity and a highly useful, reliable construct that was just invented by scientists.
It does, and the most profound modern alternatives reject realism entirely. You have constructive empiricism from Van Frassen, which argues that science only aims for empirical adequacy to save the phenomena, not for literal truth.
And then there's constructivism.
Taking inspiration from sociology and the history of science, constructivism maintains that scientific knowledge and facts are not discovered in an observer-independent world. They are inherently socially constituted. Scientific facts are the result of collective judgments and consensus built by communities of scientists. The picture of reality is dynamic and socially created.
Finally, we examine reductionism, which attempts to define the structural relationship between different scientific disciplines. For example, reducing psychology to biology, or biology to chemistry.
Reductionism is the position that the theories, entities, or phenomena of one scientific domain can be exhaustively accounted for by those of another, typically lower level, more fundamental domain.
And the traditional, very ambitious model required the laws of the reduced theory, say psychological laws, to follow deductively from the laws of the reducing theory, like neural laws.
And this deduction required the use of bridge laws. These were supposed to connect the terms of the two theories. For example, mental state X occurs if and only if brain state Y occurs.
This ambition is clearest in physicalism and the identity theory of mind.
Right, which seek ontological identities. Mental states are brain states, in the hope of replacing the upper-level theory entirely with the lower-level physics or neuroscience.
But the anti-reductionist critique has been formidable. The strongest argument is multiple realizability, which was championed by Jerry Fodor.
Multiple realizability states that psychological types, like pain or belief, can be realized by multiple, diverse neural types across different species, or even different individuals within the same species.
Think of it like a cash register.
Yes, that's a classic example. The function of addition can be realized by physical gears, silicon chips, or even a human accounting firm. The function is independent of the underlying physical mechanism.
So if psychological types can be realized by multiple neural types, the bridge laws become enormously long and disjunctive.
Mental state X occurs if and only if brain state Y, or brain state Z, or brain state A, and so on. They become non-informative.
And this severely impedes the possibility of that classical deductive reduction and provides strong support for the autonomy of psychology.
Furthermore, philosophers like Donald Davidson, with his anomalous monism, argue that psychophysical laws are impossible precisely because psychological concepts are inherently intentional and meaning-driven and normative, unlike the strict, non-normative concepts of physics.
So in light of all these critiques, the modern field has shifted toward integrative models.
These models advocate for explanatory pluralism and co-evolving theories that are mutually instructive. The focus shifts away from strict deductive replacement and moves toward the discovery and explication of mechanisms, as advocated by people like Carl Craver and Bill Bechtel.
So the goal is to discover the neurocomputational mechanisms that underlie psychological functions, seeing the psychological, computational, and neural levels as mutually interacting and influencing,
rather than hierarchically reductive.
This gives us a much more nuanced and complex picture of how sciences can cooperate. Reductionist research is still valuable, but its goal is now integration and explanation, not elimination. That alphabetical deep dive was incredibly revealing. It stitched together centuries of conflict into one unified cognitive narrative. We saw the necessary coherence required for meaning, facing the threat of Quine's deep skepticism, and the necessary innate structure argued for by rationalists and the axioms of relational grammar.
We witnessed the collapse of idealized logical systems under the weight of computational and human constraints, forcing cognitive science to embrace bounded rationality and the concept of satisficing the good enough solution that's necessary for any finite mind.
And we saw how the physical constraints of our hardware, the retina and its limitations on color resolution, impose constraints that our computational models, from recurrent networks to reinforcement learning, are designed to either emulate or, in some cases, overcome.
And finally, we explored the meta-challenge, accepting that even our understanding of scientific truth, whether we're realists committed to a stable, observer-independent world, or whether we accept the need for reductionism, these are themselves concepts subject to constant reevaluation and change.
So here's a final provocative thought for you to mull over. We saw that the core dilemma of reinforcement learning is the exploration-exploitation trade-off. The agent must constantly risk non-optimality by exploring unknown paths to find potentially better future rewards.
This behavior mirrors the philosophical tension we saw in rationality, and even in the history of science itself. If perfection like logical omniscience or ultimate realism is unattainable, does this constant inherent need for agents, whether they're human, social, or artificial, to explore beyond their current known optimum? Does that mean that imperfection or non-optimality is not a flaw?
But a fundamental, necessary condition for growth, adaptation, and progress in any finite cognitive system.
It raises the question, can true progress ever be purely rational?
Fascinating stuff to chew on. Thank you for guiding us through this incredibly dense stack of knowledge today and showing us the connections between all these foundational concepts.
My pleasure. It's always rewarding to see how these seemingly disparate philosophical, linguistic, and computational ideas really do reinforce one another.
And thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We hope this is giving you the foundational knowledge you need, quickly and thoroughly. We'll see you next time.